Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, where history, horror, and humanity collide. Every episode, we go beyond the headlines into the hidden corners of America's violence, the soldiers, the outlaws, the martyrs, and the ghosts that history tried to forget. Some of these stories are old, some are still unfolding, but they all ask the same question: what drives ordinary people to cross the line between duty and destruction? This is Deadly Truths. They called them public enemies, men who robbed banks by day and captured headlines by night. But by the end of the 1930s, their hideouts had been replaced with cell blocks and their getaway cars with wooden coffins. Leavenworth had become the vault where America locked away its most dangerous legends, and every so often it opened the trap door. The Great Depression didn't just break the economy, it broke people. Factories shuttered, farms went under, and a generation of men who'd grown up believing in the American dream suddenly found themselves starving on the roadside. Some begged, some drifted, and some picked up guns. The newspaper called them desperados. Washington called them public enemy number one. But for a while, America called them something else: heroes. Because when you had nothing left to lose, the man robbing the bank didn't seem like a villain. The bank was the villain. Between 1930 and 1935, headlines filled with names that sounded like movie titles: John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly. They robbed banks with Tommy guns and Ford F8s, outpacing police who were still driving Model Ts. They slipped across state lines, and that made them federal. J. Edgar Hoover saw his chance. The FBI was young, underfunded, and eager for a win. These outlaws became perfect enemies, and their capture became the Bureau's rise to power. By the mid-1930s, Hoover's men were waging a media war. Every bank robbery, every shootout, every headline was another victory for federal law and order. But behind the headlines, the justice system was changing. America was a country that had once turned a blind eye to vigilante hangings, but now was embracing federal executions. And the gallows at Leavenworth were awaiting. It was Leavenworth, Kansas, that had become the quiet heart of American punishment. In the 1930s, it was both fortress and factory, a place where the government manufactured obedience. The prison's stone walls were cold, geometric, and final. By day, they echoed with the clang of hammers from the prison workshops. By night, they held the soft shuffle of boots in the corridor where condemned men waited. Here, the last of the Old West met the first of the modern underworld. Moonshiners, murderers, and bank robbers all slept under the same roof, and sometimes died under it too. The local papers called it the quietest death factory in America. There were no crowds, no headlines, no dramatics, just a black hood, a short drop, and the paperwork to follow. By 1934, federal executions were routine. The rope that once swung over concrete squares was now hidden behind concrete walls. Leavenworth became the nation's hangman. Inside those walls were stories that sounded more like pulp fiction than history. Men who'd been famous for a week and forgotten for a lifetime. Some had names you'd recognize from yellowed newspaper clippings. Others were known only by their case file numbers. And one of those names still echoes in history if you look them up. You just probably haven't heard of him. Anthony Chebatoris. He was not a folk hero. He wasn't even a good criminal. But the story marked the end of a line of America's bank robbers. And it is the moment when the gallows at Leavenworth claimed its most ironic victim. It began on a warm morning in Midland, Michigan, 1938. Anthony and his partner, Jack Grandmas, decided to rob the Chemical State Bank. They were small-time crooks, more desperate than dangerous. But that day, everything went wrong. Inside the bank, they pulled their guns, shouted orders, and tried to grab the cash. outside, a local dentist named Frank Hardy saw what was happening from his office window. He didn't call the police. He grabbed his hunting rifle. When the robbers ran for the car, Hardy opened fire from the second floor. The first shot was Grandma's. The second missed and struck a bystander named Henry Porter, and he died instantly. Anthony panicked. He returned fire, he missed, and then he tried to escape in the getaway car. But the car stalled. He ran, wounded and bleeding, before being caught in a nearby field. It should have ended there. Another failed bank job, another prison sentence. But Michigan had outlawed the death penalty nearly a century earlier. The state didn't hang men. The people of Michigan prided themselves on that, but the federal government did. And since Anthony had killed someone during a bank robbery, a crime under federal jurisdiction, Washington stepped in. And if you're taking a beat to question what I just said, no, Anthony actually was not the person who accidentally shot the bystander, Henry Porter, who died instantly. It was the dentist who had missed and struck the bystander. However, the way the government saw it is if Anthony had not been robbing that bank, that bystander would not have been shot. There go. Anthony was the killer. Local officials protested in Michigan. Newspapers argued that executing him in Michigan would violate the state's constitution. But federal law had no patience for sentiment. Attorney General Homer Cummings made the call. Anthony would hang, and Leavenworth would provide those gallows. On October 29, 1938, at 5 a.m., Anthony became the first and only person ever executed for a crime committed in Michigan under federal law. He walked to the gallows without resistance. When asked for last words, he said simply, "Tell my friends goodbye." The trapdoor opened. The doctor pronounced him dead at 5:08. Outside, the press printed the headline, "Michigan has no gallows, so Washington sent him to Kansas." His death closed a strange chapter in American justice, one where the law crossed state lines just as easily as the criminals had. For all the public enemies who died in gunfights or had been gunned down in alleys, it was Anthony, a man most Americans never heard of, who became the last outlaw to hang under the symbol of the federal rope. Now, he was not alone on that list. Throughout the 1930s, Leavenworth's execution roster filled with men whose stories barely made the papers. There was Edward Blackie Wilson, a former inmate who killed a guard inside the prison. He was hung in 1930. He'd spent years planning his escape, but in the end, he only found a shorter drop. This one wasn't hung, but he might as well have been. His name was John Callahan. He was a low-level associate of John Dillinger's crew. Callahan was not a killer. He was a driver and an errand boy. After Dillinger's death, he turned informant, ready to testify about safe houses and connections. But if he would have testified, it would have embarrassed the Bureau. So, before he could take the stand, Callahan was found stabbed to death in his cell. The death was ruled inmate assault. The papers hinted at mob retribution, but the story disappeared within a week. Leavenworth didn't care if you were famous or forgotten. Its walls treated every man the same. And that's what we're learning, isn't it? Steel bars, thin blankets, and the ticking of a clock that only counted down. Machine Gun Kelly served his time here too, pacing the same cell blocks where the condemned once prayed. And yes, I am going to do an episode that discusses him in considerably more detail. But for now, we'll keep it quick. He used to joke that Leavenworth's quieter than death. He wasn't wrong. By 1939, the golden age of bank robbers was over. Dillinger was dead in a Chicago alley. Pretty boy Floyd was shot down in an Ohio cornfield. Babyface Nelson died in a roadside gun battle that left 2 FBI agents dead. Creepy Krampus, the last of the top 4 public enemies, was surrounded and went to Alcatraz. The FBI had won, but the victory came with a body count. And for every gangster headline that faded away, Leavenworth gained another ghost. The federal gallows in Kansas became a quiet symbol of finality, the end of every criminal legend. There were no photographs, no witnesses outside, the warden, a doctor, and a few guards. It's just the same ending, repeated again and again. And then those final moments, each man followed the same ritual: the reading of a sentence, the walk, the hood, the rope. A few prayed, but most didn't. By the time the lever was pulled, the newspapers had already moved on to the next crisis, the next war, and the next enemy, and so on it goes. Nothing's changed much if you think about it. The 1930s had begun with gunfire and ended with silence. The trap door at Leavenworth closed on the last of the bank robbers, and with them, it closed on an era. The outlaw who once defied the system now belonged to it. Another line item in a prison ledger. But like everything, the echoes linger. In every town where a bank stood empty, in every courthouse that once held a crowd waiting for news, the ghost of the public enemy remained. They started as men trying to survive the Great Depression. They ended as cautionary tales for a new America. Leavenworth's gallows would keep swinging for a few more decades, for murderers and spies and soldiers, but the age of the outlaw was done. The rope that once symbolized the taming of the frontier had become a tool of bureaucracy. The executioner was no longer wearing a mask, he had a badge. When you stand outside the old prison today, I think you can feel the weight of history. The stone walls rise like a monument to finality. There are no plaques for the condemned. There are no markers for the men who dropped through that trap door. There is just the silence of an institution that outlived all of them. In a way, Leavenworth became the last stop on the American's outlaw journey, from the open rows to the closed cell, from freedom to procedure, from rebellion to regulation. The irony is almost poetic. The men who once robbed banks for money ended up paying the ultimate debt with their lives. They thought they were stealing time, but time was what the government always took back. The empty cells, the buried bodies, the echo of a name that no one remembered. By 1940, Hoover's America was already looking ahead to another kind of war, one that would send men overseas instead of to the gallows. The last of the Depression-era robbers faded into the background of new national enemies, and the gallows themselves, once a symbol of frontier justice, were replaced by electric chairs and gas chambers in newer, colder prisons. But if you listen closely, history still whispers through those corridors, the echoes of boots, the clink of a chain, the murmur of a prayer. You can almost hear it, the sound of a vault closing, and the last withdrawal complete. Because for America's public enemies, Leavenworth wasn't just a prison, it was the end of the story. It is the last place where rebellion met the rope. It is the final balance sheet between greed, glory, and death. For men and for the era that made them, Leavenworth was the last withdrawal. You've been listening to Deadly Truths. I'm Becca. If this story pulled you in, follow, rate, and share the show on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and on Audible. Full video episodes are now streaming on YouTube Podcast with extended versions on Spotify. Research and narration is, of course, done by me. Can't you tell? And remember, the past is not dead. It's just doing time at Leavenworth. Stay tuned for our next episode, The Last Call at Leavenworth, a story that feels like the final night of a speakeasy. The music fading, the whiskey dry, and the hangman waiting at the door. You won't want to miss that one.